lot of people wondering what we're going to talk about every time we try to talk about a different issue that will educate our senators and our members. This one, a lot of people don't understand how important this anti-bully legislation and the fight against it should be. A lot of people are just concerned about taxes and what's immediately affecting their pocketbook, but this legislation affects our children. It affects the future of our culture. And some of this legislation, people who are psychologists and teachers who are supposed to be teaching our kids to learn how to live with each other are being told just to tattle to the state, to some bureaucracy, and they're being turned from teachers and psychologists into policemen. It's not very good for the growth of our children. So I know Katherine Kersten has been very active in trying to stop legislation last term. It looks like this time it's going to come back with a vengeance. So I hope that she can help us this evening. I was asked to introduce her. She's a writer and an attorney and a contributor to the Star Tribune, where she worked previously as a columnist, and she was a founding director of the Center of American Experiment. We've had Mitch Pearlstein, the president, here in the past. She's written on cultural and policy issues for a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, Christianity Today, Policy Review, American Enterprise, and First Things. I can go on, but she's the author, with Mitch Pearlstein, of a book called Close to Home, a collection of columns on a variety of public policy issues, and the center has published several of her monographs on education. She's a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and holds a master's degree from Yale University and a JD from the University of Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Kersten.
Well, thanks so much for having me tonight. This is a wonderful group, and it was inspirational to hear all of these legislators speak from their hearts about the battle that they plan on engaging. And I know all of us are very supportive of their wonderful efforts. So I was honored to be asked to speak tonight. And as Gordon said, I will be speaking about the bullying or anti-bullying issue that is so hot now at the legislature. And of course, we all know that virtually all Minnesotans oppose bullying. If you were short or plump in 6th grade, you may have cringed from bullies yourself. Many of us, of course, have kids who have suffered through bullying. And we all want children to treat each other with civility and respect in school. It goes without saying. But unfortunately, the anti-bullying campaign unfolding over the last several years here in Minnesota is not primarily about protecting children. It is first and foremost about using the power of the state to compel children to adopt politically correct attitudes on social issues, such as the nature of human sexuality, gender identity, and alternative family structures. Let me just give you a brief history. In the last session, Representative Davney introduced House File 826, the Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools bill, which passed in the House and after some changes, but never did come to a vote in the Senate. It is back, and we don't know exactly what form it's going to take. Two bills were introduced in the special session, two identical bills, which were referred to as House File 9 and Senate File 3. It's not quite clear how they will come together with, replace whatever House File 826. But we will, thank you. We will clearly be seeing some significant anti-bullying legislation. Now, the stage for today's debate was set back in August 2012 by Governor Dayton's task force on the prevention of school bullying, which issued a report that provided recommendations on the shape that a new law should take. And the task force called for throwing out Minnesota's current local control anti-bullying bill, which requires all schools to adopt a written policy, quote, prohibiting intimidation and bullying of any student, and replacing it with a sweeping new anti-bullying regime administered from St. Paul. Now, the task force's fundamental assumption was that school bullying is a pervasive and growing problem across Minnesota and America. But in fact, incidents of bullying and intimidation have actually been dropping markedly in recent years, according to studies that the Federal Department of Justice has performed. While the task force gave the impression that LGBT students are a primary focus of bullying, evidence really suggests that a vast majority of bullying incidents are directed at other students for more traditional reasons. Now, the DOJ studies indicate that the percentage of 12 to 18-year-olds who report being targets of hate-related words based on their sexual orientation fell from 1% in 2007 to 0.6% in 2009. That's the direction that the surveys suggest these incidents are taking. The history of the current campaign for anti-bullying legislation, with its origin back in the governor's task force and the nature and the focus of the legislation that it spawned, make clear that the campaign we're seeing is not driven by a dramatic escalation in the number of bullying incidents, but by a crusade to use the power of the state to shape your 10-year-old's attitudes and beliefs about sexuality and alternative family structures. And the drive is being led by Outfront Minnesota, which is the state's most prominent LGBT group, whose legal director was a member of the governor's task force on bullying, and whose associate policy director now directs the Safe Schools for All Coalition, which is leading the charge for this legislation at the Capitol. Details of the anti-bullying bill introduced by Representative Jim Dabney and Senator Scott Dibble at the beginning of the 2013 session make that very clear. As I said, it was passed by the House and not voted on by the Senate. And one of the most striking and really ironic things about the bill was that it did not treat all children equally. And that remains true of its successor. Instead, it singles out 19 so-called protected classes of students, including race, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity and expression. Get used to that phrase. We're hearing it a lot. Singled out these groups for special attention and favored treatment. The traditional victims of bullying, kids who are shy or viewed as nerds by their classmates, are essentially invisible in this bill and in the legislation that we're likely to see pushed forward in coming weeks. So let's talk first about the bill last session, House File 826. It focused primarily on requiring students to adopt certain attitudes and beliefs rather than focusing on prohibiting conduct and behavior. And you see this immediately when you look at the heart of the bill, which is, of course, its definition of bullying. Now, the bill defined as prohibited bullying even, quote, one word that could have a so-called detrimental effect on another student's emotional health, that is, could hurt his or her feelings. So a child who said even one such word could be labeled a bully, a stigma that could follow him for the rest of his school career. And that means, as an ACLU lawyer pointed out about a similar bill in another state, that if one sixth grader calls another a loser on the school bus, he becomes guilty of bullying. The bus driver who hears his comment will have to report it, and the school will have to investigate it. Now, House File 826 prohibited conduct or speech by a student or by adult school personnel that created an imbalance of power among students. What in the world does that mean? It essentially guaranteed certain favored groups of students a, quote, safe and supportive learning environment in school, again, undefined, and prohibited as bullying any words a student could argue interfered with his educational performance. And so that means if one girl overhears another telling others not to vote for her as class secretary, under House File 826, she could claim to be a victim of bullying because the comment caused her such emotional distress that she bombed a quiz. The bill virtually guaranteed certain favored groups that they have an absolute right not to have their feelings hurt or their ideas challenged, and that authorities will intervene if this occurs. And it also compelled schools to police so-called cyberbullying, including comments that a student would post on his Facebook page in his pajamas at midnight, something schools don't actually have a lot of control over. Well, as you can see, House File 826 raised very serious free speech issues under the First Amendment of our Constitution. And that was true not just in the context of personal interaction among students, but interaction in the classroom as well. The bill's prohibition of words that a protected class student might deem offensive threatened to chill classroom discussion on a host of controversial topics. For example, if a student in a social studies class says that she opposes illegal immigration, a Hispanic student could technically claim to be offended or charge that this statement created a, quote, imbalance of power or interfered with a safe and supportive learning environment, both of which the bill prohibited as bullying. So as a result, some teachers might be tempted to avoid controversial topics altogether to avoid being charged with allowing a hostile environment to develop in his or her classroom. One of House File 826's most chilling aspects was that students who dissent from certain state-approved cultural political attitudes, who maintain, for example, that children do best when they have a parent of both sexes, a mom and a dad, could potentially be referred for counseling by school authorities for failing to sufficiently, quote, value diversity. But as you can see, House File 826 raised serious First Amendment concerns. As I said, the Supreme Court has made clear that students do not check their First Amendment free speech rights at the schoolhouse door. The bill's assault on free speech was so egregious that Professor Michael Paulson, who is a nationally recognized scholar on First Amendment issues and religious rights, declared that its violation of the First Amendment was, quote, almost reckless, and he described its disclaimer to this effect to be almost comical and certainly farcical, in his words. But in the 2014 session, there are people here who could actually tell us perhaps more in a more up-to-date way what the status of things is with the bill. But it appears that Senator Dibble and Representative Davney will be advancing a bill with some new language, perhaps a changed definition of bullying that will help to avoid some of the more egregious First Amendment violations that we saw in the original version of House File 826. But the new bill, of course, is likely to have many flaws that will give us all great concern. Its definition of bullying is likely to be very vague, comprehending behavior that is, quote, objectively offensive, and it depends on who the person viewing the behavior is. Its primary focus still appears to be shaping children's attitudes rather and getting them to jump in line behind a state-approved cultural agenda rather than prohibiting conduct we would all agree is abusive and bullying. The primary vehicle for imposing this agenda will, of course, be the training that students must receive in connection with the school's anti-bullying policy. The bill, 826 that is, and also House File 9 and Senate File 3, which may be replacing it in some way, requires schools to consult with unnamed community organizations as they implement and they choose and implement curricula. And you can be sure that schools will not be turning for help to the organization that I represent, Center of the American Experiment, for help with this. Instead, aggressive special interest advocacy groups like Out Front involved with this legislation from the very beginning will push to have a role. And of course, the School Climate Center at the Department of Education will exert pressure on local schools to be involved with these kinds of groups. Like its predecessor, House File 826, the bill we're likely to see will foist re-education, not just on children, but on adults in a school. All adults involved with a school, from teachers and lunch ladies and custodians and contractors to parent volunteers, will be required to participate in anti-bullying training. And if you want to discourage parents, busy parents, from volunteering their time at school, this is certainly one way that's likely to have that effect. The bill also provides that school staff and volunteers can be charged themselves with bullying. The new bill, like the old bill, will probably create an administrative nightmare for school officials and impose burdensome and confusing reporting responsibilities on teachers and school staff. For example, House File 826 gives schools 3 days to investigate alleged bullying incidents. And as the Minnesota School Boards Association has objected, a serious review of these kinds of incidents will likely involve multiple interviews and compilations of testimony, hopefully parental notification, although that is not required in the bill. And is 3 days really going to be sufficient for this kind of review? I think many people involved with education would say no. Well, what is the anti-bullying curriculum likely to look like in Minnesota schools if this bill passes? Well, there are 2 important points to consider. As I've already mentioned, the bill would give special interest groups access to Minnesota K-12 classrooms under the banner of creating safe and supportive environments. It requires districts, as I said, to consult with unnamed community organizations to do this. The second crucial point is that under the bill, schools can lose their state aid if the Department of Education judges that they discriminate against LGBT students or those with gender identity issues by not providing a sufficiently positive school climate. So faced with this threat, what are schools likely to do? Well, I suggest they're likely to follow Outfront's recommendations and turn for help to organizations that it endorses, help in putting together their bullying curricula and training. The first such organization that I have researched is endorsed by and suggested for use by schools for this kind of exercise is the Human Rights Campaign and its Welcoming Schools curriculum. This is a K-6 anti-bullying program, some aspects of which were piloted in Minneapolis at the Hale School in 2008. And I have read through this curriculum. I can tell you that at least when I looked at it, it had very little to do with bullying and a lot to do with ensuring that kids as young as age 5 submit to the HRC's orthodoxy on sexual matters. For example, the curriculum advised teachers not to call students boys and girls on grounds that this can create, quote, internal dissonance in some students. It called for students to read books like Sissy Duckling and to be evaluated on, quote, whether or not they feel comfortable making choices outside gender expectations. Kids in grades 3 through 5 acted out being members of non-traditional families, including same-sex headed households. Another organization that is touted by Outfront Minnesota is GLSEN, which stands for the Gay, Lesbian Education Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. And GLSEN describes itself as the leading national organization fighting to end anti-gay bias in K-12 schools. GLSEN maintains that safe schools require, quote, LGBT affirming curricula. And it says, LGBT people, history, and events can be easily inserted into most content areas of the curriculum. Here's what they recommend. In a safe school, Science teachers acknowledge the gay identity of Francis Bacon, creator of the scientific method, while art teachers identify the artist Frida Kahlo as bisexual. In math class, students are taught to analyze LGBT demographic trends. For example, creating charts illustrating, quote, the number of same-sex couples raising children, the number of adopted or foster children in LGBT-headed households. You get the idea. In a safe school, students, says Glisson, can participate on sports teams according to their gender identity. And presumably, this will apply to locker rooms and gym class as well. Glisson encourages schools to show a film entitled Straight-Laced, How Genders Got Us All Tied Up, which describes the many gender identities now available to students. And it applauds Facebook's recent decision, which they call exciting, to offer, quote, custom gender settings beyond male and female. And here's what Glisson's website says. You can now choose from a list of 50 identities, the ones that suit you best, such as, get ready for this, gender queer, trans male, or cis female. And you can use pronouns such as, or nouns such as boy, B-O-I, Z, kind of between he and she, I guess, femme or girl, G-U-R-L. And I looked at this, I thought, what, I can kind of get what trans male means, but what does cis female mean? That's C-I-S. So I looked it up, I Googled it today. You know what it means? Cis is the opposite in Latin of trans. So trans means across the line. Cis means you're on the other side of the line. So a cis female is a woman born in a woman's body who identifies as a woman. That's what it says. Well, it's likely, I suggest, that school officials who endorsed this bill, and you know that Education Minnesota is now one of its great supporters, do not fully understand the nature of much teen conduct that goes by the name of bullying. And here I think it's useful to look at a recent book which is entitled Sticks and Stones by Emily Bazelon. Got a lot of press last year. Bazelon warns that overbroad definitions of bullying can turn a manageable problem for schools into an overwhelming problem. And she points out that most teen conflict involves not the sort of egregious bullying that those of us who attended the hearings last year heard about, but what students call drama. Yes. And this involves gossip and rumors and often mean-spirited back and forth, backbiting. And Emily Bazelon notes that the commonality of drama is not surprising given how many teenagers today fill their evenings watching popular shows like, I don't know if it's still on, but she mentions Jersey Shore, which is a program that glamorizes conduct like this. And she emphasizes, too, that in studying cases of bullying that she wrote about, and she focused in this book on 3, she spent a year studying these 3 cases of bullying. And she found it extremely difficult, she said, to penetrate the complexities and to arrive at the truth about the lives and the bullying of the students she investigated. She adds that the same is generally true of teen suicides that the media attribute to bullying for convenient reasons. Often, she said, she found that young people involved in these incidents are not easily categorized as perpetrator and victim. And she stresses that schools need to be aware of how difficult it can be to get to the bottom of these cases, the truth about teen conflict when they adopt bullying policies. So I'll close with this point. I suspect that most Minnesotans have no idea of the radical changes that these Safe and Supportive Schools Act may work in our state schools if it is adopted. And you certainly will not be hearing about this brave new world from the bill's sponsors. And I want to thank our legislators who are here tonight and everyone in this room who's worked against this legislation for your important and inspiring efforts. And no matter what the legislature does on this issue, we must continue this battle for the sake of our children's future. Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to have you. I love your writing.
Thank you.
One of the terms you missed was gender fluid.
Oh,
It's one of the ones that Facebook
That's one of
offers.
the 50.
Yeah,
It is.
I can't figure out what that one is. You mentioned
That's not being sure from day to day which way you will go. It is.
I don't want to know. My question is, you mentioned the First Amendment with this bullying bill, and it hadn't occurred to me that there's some really serious First Amendment issues here. What do you think are the chances, given that we have a fully controlled, DFL train wreck coming down the pipe here, what do you think the chances are in the courts of this getting challenged successfully?
House File 826, which was Senate File 783, basically the companion bill, was unbelievably egregious in its unconstitutionality on a variety of fronts. It included originally private and religious schools, and it also included the definition of bullying that I mentioned initially. One word that hurts people's feelings or creates an imbalance of power. I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee on that and brought forward the written testimony of Professor Michael Paulson at the University of St. Thomas Law School in Minneapolis. He is a nationally, as I mentioned, nationally recognized authority on the First Amendment. And he was joined in his derision of this bill and its unconstitutionality by George Will, who wrote a national column that mentioned it, and Eugene Volokh, a very prominent blogger who's also a professor of law, saying, this is just beyond the pale on so many fronts. I think as a result of that, what I've heard, and I don't know if this has been substantiated, but I've heard that the authors took the bill to our Attorney General, which is something Michael Paulson urged them to do. And as a result, they scaled back some of the red flag language. I think the same kind of danger may exist there in a tighter form. It's just better disguised. But it certainly is would be harder for zealous advocates to seize on the language of the definition in the way they could have so easily with the original language in 826. I think a really interesting issue here is cyberbullying, and I understand the courts are split on that because these are sects and texts and Facebook postings and all that are done off school premises, and the courts this is still so new that it's very hard to predict exactly what direction that will take. But I think we saw an example of this recently in Rogers, right?
Yes.
So that's going to be the beginning, I think. Now, the North Dakota bill, which has received a very good rating from Bully Police,
Bully.gov.
Bully.gov, does not include that kind of thing, at least in any way that would open the door the way that this bill does to court challenge. So it's very, very difficult to know what we can expect to see in that regard. And I might just say that I know that the Minnesota Catholic Conference of Bishops, even though religious and private schools have been removed in the sense that they are now encouraged to submit their bullying policy, encouraged to report by 19, according to 19 protected classes. They are concerned that what is encouraged this year will be mandated next year. And they're also concerned about the religious freedom of religious students in public schools who are going to be subjected to this kind of propaganda.
Further questions? And as I bring the microphone back there, I'll just also mention that even with their private schools sort of being taken out initially, that they're still used as evaluation for possible accreditation.
Yeah.
And we even saw, I analyzed last year's bill, that it didn't even stop at age 17. It went right into college. If there's ever a place where you need to have robust freedom of expression, it ought to be at your university. So, anyway.
I'm concerned that the ambiguity that's going to be injected into children is going to make them more troubled, that it's not going to alleviate anybody's troubles, it's going to explode troubles, exacerbate, and this is going to have a secondary impact on the teacher community because the the teacher demographic is going to, the individual teacher is going to know that they're facing someone who's more troubled, and their job to critique with effective criticism, wholesome criticism, is going to be hamstrung.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how do you see this playing out for the teaching profession?
Well, I think teachers walk such a fine line, and we can see what they may face by looking at the Anoka-Hennepin schools. That district has been made a model by the Obama administration for the kind of heavy-handed pressure that schools are likely to face going forward. This entire effort really springs from the Obama Department of Education, because in 2010, our governor's task force report came out in 2012, but in 2010, the Obama Department of Education Office for Civil Rights issued a so-called Dear Colleague letter, which went to schools all over the country. It's like a long letter, and they explain, this is exactly what they're trying to do. They want to recast the idea of school bullying, which is age-old, right?
Yes.
I mean, thousands of years old. They want to recast it in modern civil rights framework that is open to litigation, is open to the idea of harassment springing from a hostile environment toward a protected group. That's exactly the framework that was used by the federal government to go into the Anoka-Hennepin schools. They conducted a big investigation. You know, Anoka-Hennepin had this policy of neutrality, where homosexuality teachers were supposed to be neutral. It wasn't going to be taught specifically in the curriculum. And it was this policy that the federal government seized on as creating a hostile environment for LGBT students. And then these two civil rights groups, the Southern Poverty Law Center and the National Lesbian Rights Group, whatever their name is, they jumped on the bandwagon and they sued the school. And I've heard from people who were part of that it was an absolute nightmare. And now there's a settlement, and the school is moving forward under a 5-year consent decree. And I believe that the Department of Education was just there recently evaluating, talking with students. Do you feel safe? But who knows what safe means? And how do you know if a black student is bullied? Why was he bullied? Just because he's a member of a protected class? Do you say, oh, he was bullied because he was black? No, I mean, maybe, who knows? Who knows? Kids are bullied for all kinds of reasons, and the people who perpetrate it can't often describe why they chose that person as a bully. So when you put this in a civil rights framework of protected groups, I think you put teachers in a really, really difficult position, because they can suffer recriminations if they are not seen as intervening correctly or creating an unsafe environment for a protected class student. So it's going to be a tough thing for teachers, I think, in activist type school districts. Maybe not in Hinckley, Minnesota, but I think in our bigger metro area districts it'll be a problem.
The more activist districts in the metro area, I went to caucus at Stillwater High School, and there was a poster right as you walked in the front door that was from GLSEN, right as you walked in the front door. There's not a whole lot of other advocacy posters there, but that one said, no sticks, no stones, no name calling.
They have a no name calling week.
Mm-hmm.
That's their big national week when they try to fill the schools with all of these films and things.
Today in the media, on the news tonight, they were talking about this bullying bill being introduced. Some of the comments were about the progressives and how it's all going, but also a discussion was brought up and quoted by the media that the Republican Party is going to be working with the Democrats to produce a comprehensive, appropriate bullying bill. I'm just wondering how that would conflict with the LEA report, where we stand on this issue, where you apparently stand, and what you know about what's defined as a comprehensive, appropriate bullying legislation out of both the Republicans and Democrats working together.
to my knowledge, I mean, is this okay to talk about?
Yes.
Yeah. There is going to be a bullying bill passed this session. That's what everyone seems to agree on. So it's, I should say that you've probably heard repeatedly from out front that we have the weakest bullying bill in the nation at 37 words. Of course, it's a local control bill. What they don't tell you is that the vast majority of school districts in the state have adopted the 6-page model anti-bullying policy put forward by the Minnesota School Boards Association. Nevertheless, the feeling seems to be that if there's going to be a bill, the other side needs to have an alternative to the Safe and Supportive Schools Act. One model that I think has been looked at very seriously is the North Dakota bill, which has actually been endorsed by Attorney General Lori Swanson back in 2011. She said that this bill gets an A++ rating from the StopBullying.gov people, or the Bully Police organization. And I have read this bill, and it's infinitely preferable to the Safe and Supportive School bill. If you're going to have a bill of this kind, it is short. It does not discriminate among student groups the way that the Safe and Supportive Schools bill does. It respects local districts, gives them the ability to use local resources to take care of local problems. So I think that's what we're going to see as an alternative. Comprehensive in the sense that it protects all kids in a way that the Safe and Supportive Schools Act does not.
Even bringing this up, I feel as though I'm being bullied.
Yeah.
But,
You are.
what alternatives do I have now?
Well, maybe Michelle Lenz, who's here,
Yeah.
could also comment on this, but I was told by my researcher this afternoon that the Senate will hear this bill on Thursday. Is that correct, Michelle?
Yeah.
And my researcher texted me and said he thinks that the 2 changes that are going to be proposed that the School Boards Association likes is, one, there will have to be repeated occurrences, and secondly, this imbalance of power will be changed. Now, maybe Michelle knows something different, but those are the only 2 pieces, or the only 2 changes that he was aware of that might occur in that committee.
That imbalance of power language was taken out of 826. I mean, I haven't seen it. I guess I haven't looked at. Well, I haven't seen it in there. Maybe it still is in some way that I've missed. But that, of course, is absolutely meaningless in a legal context. How in the world do you prohibit an imbalance of power between 2 kids in the school? Michelle, do you have any thoughts? Well, why don't we talk about your group and what you're doing?
My name is Michelle Lentz. I'm the state coordinator for the CPL action. Now we're famous, apparently, for the billboards that went up around the state. If they make those changes, it'll turn the bill from a horribly, horribly, horribly bad bill to a horribly, horribly, horribly bad bill. So it doesn't matter. The bill is coming up Thursday in the Senate Finance Committee, and it's the 3rd bill on the list. That doesn't mean that they won't take it up first, but there are 3 other bills. It could get referred back to K-12. It depends if there's significant changes. I think we would probably agree Senator Dibble is going to change this bill. But what that will look like, I don't know. But it could get referred to another committee, or it could go right to the Senate floor. We are in the 11th hour on this issue. The good news is they thought it was a done deal last year, and it is by no means a done deal anymore because the people of Minnesota have risen up. But we have to keep the pressure on. There is no fixing this bill, so no matter what you hear in the media, there is no fixing this bill. Your kids, your grandkids are at risk. What they will do psychologically and physically to the health of children by exposing them to the curriculum that is going to be forced into the schools to make it inclusive, to make it diverse, is beyond It's beyond debatable. I don't know if you understand this. It's beyond debatable. The science is established. This stuff is harmful to kids. What we have in our current school system that our school deems as developmentally appropriate also meets the definition of Minnesota statute for what is obscene. Yet we exempt our public school teachers from our obscenity laws. And in this bill, and this is the last thing I'll say, and I'll give it back to you and you can maybe add to this. In this bill, schools are encouraged to teach developmentally appropriate curriculum in, among other things, human sexuality in pre-K through 12th grade, every subject. You used to be able to opt your kids out of that. You can't opt your kids out of it if this bill passes. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, thanks for coming.